Have you ever wondered what the very first gods of humanity looked like? Long before Zeus or Odin, there was a world where sky gods clashed with sea monsters, where humans were shaped from clay, and where the secrets of life and death were guarded by divine powers. Tonight, as you relax and drift into sleep, we'll take you on a journey back over 5,000 years to the birthplace of mythology itself. This is where it all began. Fall asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths. The first gods and the creation. When you hear the phrase fall asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths, it may sound like a huge journey, and it truly is. The story begins at the dawn of time, before there were cities, kings, or even people. The Mesopotamians believed that in the beginning, there was only water. This water was not peaceful, but it held two great powers: the fresh water, called Apsu, and the salt water, called Tiamat. Together, they represented the very first gods, the foundation of everything. The ancient texts say that when these waters mingled, they gave birth to other gods. From them came Lamu and Lahamu, the first divine children. Then, generations followed, Anshar and Kishar, who symbolized the horizon of heaven and earth. Eventually, from these lineages came the more powerful deities that shaped the Mesopotamian view of the cosmos. This idea of creation is known through the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. It tells us how the younger gods disturbed Apsu with their noise. Apsu wanted to silence them forever, but Tiamat, the salt water, at first resisted. However, as the younger gods became more restless and powerful, Tiamat herself grew angry. This clash between older gods and younger gods is at the heart of many myths. It shows how Mesopotamians imagined the universe as a place of conflict, order rising out of chaos, and younger powers taking control of the old. One of the most important figures in this story is Ea, also called Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and magic. Ea discovered Apsu's plan to destroy the younger gods. Using his great knowledge, he cast a spell that put Apsu into a deep sleep, and then he killed him. From this act of violence, Ea became one of the most powerful gods of the younger generation. He built his home upon Apsu's waters, symbolizing the victory of wisdom over raw, ancient chaos. But this act enraged Tiamat. She created a monstrous army of creatures, dragons, serpents, and demons, to fight against the gods who had betrayed her. She placed a new leader at their head, a god named Kingu, and gave him the Tablet of Destinies, which gave absolute authority to the one who held it. With this, Tiamat declared war. Here enters the hero of the story, Marduk, the storm god, son of Ea. Marduk agreed to face Tiamat in battle, but only on one condition: that if he won, he would be given supreme authority over all gods. The Council of Gods agreed, and they gave him powerful weapons. Marduk went out to face the sea goddess Tiamat. The battle is one of the most dramatic episodes in Mesopotamian mythology. Marduk cast a net around Tiamat and blew a mighty wind into her mouth, forcing it open. Then he shot an arrow into her heart, killing her. Afterward, he split her body in two. With one half, he formed the heavens. With the other, he formed the earth. The rivers, mountains, and skies all came from her body. The world itself, in the eyes of the Mesopotamians, was born out of divine struggle and sacrifice. This theme is important in Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths: creation through conflict, order carved from chaos, life made from the death of older forces. It reflects the way people of Mesopotamia understood their harsh environment. Floods, storms, and war were common, but from them, civilization grew. The birth of humanity. After Marduk established his rule, the question remained: who would serve the gods? The gods were powerful, but they did not wish to do the endless work of maintaining creation. So Marduk had an idea. From the blood of Kingu, the defeated commander of Tiamat's army, Marduk created mankind. Humans were formed from both divine essence and the body of a rebel. This gave humanity a special place, part servant, part divine creation, but also linked to rebellion and imperfection. The humans were tasked with providing offerings, building temples, and sustaining the gods with worship. In return, the gods allowed humans to live upon the earth, farm its fields, and build their societies. This balance between humans and gods was central to Mesopotamian life. The people saw themselves as servants of the divine, but also as beings who carried the spark of divine blood. Every ritual, every temple, and every prayer reminded them of this connection. In Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths, this moment, the creation of mankind, is a cornerstone. It shows why the people of Mesopotamia saw religion as the core of life. They believed they were born to maintain the order that Marduk had carved out of Tiamat's chaos. The role of Anu, Enlil, and Ea. To fully understand these myths, we must know the great trio of Mesopotamian gods, Anu, Enlil, and Ea or Enki. These three formed a divine hierarchy. Anu, the sky god, represented ultimate authority, though he often remained distant. Enlil, god of air and storms, was the active ruler, bringing both destruction and fertility. He was feared and respected as the one who controlled the destiny of kings and nations. Ea, the god of wisdom and water, was the clever protector, often helping humanity and shaping their fate with intelligence rather than brute force. These three, along with Marduk, represented different aspects of divine rule. Anu gave legitimacy, Enlil brought power, Ea gave knowledge, and Marduk embodied kingship through victory. Together, they showed that the universe, according to Mesopotamian belief, was run by balance between authority, power, wisdom, and struggle. Myths as reflections of life. Why were these myths told and retold? Because they explained the world. To the people of Mesopotamia, floods of the Tigris and Euphrates could destroy crops just as easily as they could nourish them. Kings rose and fell. Cities flourished and collapsed. Life itself felt like the battle between Tiamat and Marduk. Chaos and order locked in eternal struggle. In telling the story of gods, the people found meaning in their own struggles. Temples were built as reminders of these cosmic battles. Rituals, sacrifices, and prayers were ways of renewing the balance established by the gods. Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths allows us to step into that world, to imagine how these stories comforted ancient people. They did not see themselves as alone in the universe. Every storm, every harvest, every war was part of a divine drama that began when the waters of Apsu and Tiamat first moved. After the creation of mankind and the rise of the great gods, Mesopotamian myths continued to shape how people understood their world. Life itself was seen as part of a fragile balance between chaos and order, and this balance could be broken at any time. The gods were powerful, but they were not always gentle or kind. They demanded respect, offerings, and loyalty, and when they were angered, they could unleash terrible punishment upon the world. One of the strongest examples of this is the myth of the Great Flood, a story that would echo far beyond Mesopotamia and influence later cultures, even appearing in the Bible. In this tale, the gods decided that humanity had become too noisy, disturbing the divine realm. The high gods debated among themselves, and it was Enlil, Lord of the Air, who chose destruction. He planned to wipe out all of humankind with a flood that would cover the earth. But not all gods agreed with this harsh plan. Ea, the god of wisdom and protector of humanity, secretly warned a man named Atrahasis, in other versions, Utnapishtim. Ea whispered to him through the walls of his house, telling him to build a massive boat. On this boat, Atrahasis was to gather his family, along with pairs of animals, to preserve life. Atrahasis obeyed, building a vessel sealed with pitch, strong enough to withstand the rising waters. When the flood came, it was as devastating as Enlil had promised. The storm raged for days, covering fields, homes, and cities. The rivers overflowed until the entire world was swallowed by water. For 7 days and 7 nights, winds and rain pounded the earth. Atrahasis, with his family and animals, survived inside the great boat, while outside, all living beings perished. Finally, when the waters receded, Atrahasis released a dove and then a raven to search for dry land. When the bird did not return, he knew the flood was over. He stepped out of the boat, built an altar, and made an offering to the gods. The smell of the sacrifice rose to the heavens, and the gods gathered around it, hungry and regretful. Enlil was furious that some humans had survived, but Ea calmed him. He explained that humanity did not need to be destroyed entirely. Instead, ways could be found to control the population through illness, famine, and mortality. The flood myth ends with a new understanding. Humans would continue to live, but they would always be fragile, their lives limited, and their survival dependent on the will of the gods. In Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths, this flood story shows us the deep fear and respect the Mesopotamians had for their deities. It reveals how natural disasters, so common in the land between the rivers, were explained through divine anger. At the same time, it shows the compassion of Ea, who ensured that life could continue, even if it meant humanity's role would always be humble and uncertain. The gods did not only shape the world in great cosmic events like creation or flood. They also watched over the lives of kings, cities, and ordinary people. Every city in Mesopotamia had its own patron deity, a god or goddess who was believed to dwell in the city's temple and protect its people. In Uruk, the great city of walls, the patron goddess was Inanna, also known as Ishtar. She was one of the most complex figures in Mesopotamian mythology. Goddess of love, beauty, war, and fertility, Inanna was unpredictable, both nurturing and destructive. Her myths tell us much about how the Mesopotamians saw the dual nature of life: joy and suffering, love and war, all intertwined. One of the most famous stories about Inanna is her descent into the underworld. The tale begins with Inanna deciding to visit the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. She announced her journey and dressed in her finest garments, wearing jewels, a crown, and robes of power. But the underworld was a place where no living being was meant to go freely. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, Inanna was forced to remove one piece of clothing or jewelry. By the time she reached her sister, she stood naked, stripped of all her symbols of power. Ereshkigal, filled with rage, struck Inanna down and hung her body on a hook. With the goddess of love and fertility dead, the world above began to wither. Crops failed, animals ceased to reproduce, and despair spread among humans and gods alike. The other gods realized that without Inanna, life itself could not continue. Ea once again acted as a savior, creating a pair of strange beings who slipped into the underworld with offerings for Ereshkigal. Touched by their sympathy, Ereshkigal granted them favor, and they asked for Inanna's body. She was brought back to life, but only under one condition: someone else had to take her place in the underworld. When Inanna returned to the world of the living, she sought someone to bear her fate. At last, she chose Dumuzi, her lover, the shepherd god. He was taken to the underworld, but through compromise, it was decided that he would spend half the year below, while his sister would take his place for the other half. This myth explained the changing of the seasons, fertility and growth when Dumuzi returned, barrenness and cold when he was gone. In Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths, the descent of Inanna is one of the most powerful examples of death and rebirth. It shows the cycle of life, the inevitability of loss, and the hope of renewal. Just as the Mesopotamians saw the rivers rise and fall, the fields bloom and then wither, so too did they see the gods themselves as bound by cycles of death and return. The underworld itself was a vital part of Mesopotamian belief. Known as the land of no return, it was a dark and dusty place where souls went after death. Unlike in some other traditions, it was not divided into rewards and punishments. All souls, whether kings or peasants, descended to the same gloomy realm. They lived there as shadows, eating dust, cut off from the world above. Ereshkigal ruled there alone, except for her servants. Even the gods had little power in her domain. Once someone entered, they could not leave, except in rare myths like Inanna's. This view of the afterlife gave the Mesopotamians a strong reason to focus on the present world. Life was short, the underworld held no joy, So what mattered most was maintaining order, pleasing the gods, and securing prosperity while alive. The fear of this bleak afterlife can be felt throughout Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths. It is a reminder that to the ancient people, their relationship with the gods was not just about death, but about keeping life itself possible. The gods of Mesopotamia were not distant. They were believed to be present in their temples, represented in statues, and carried in processions. Every festival, every sacrifice, was a renewal of the bond between gods and humans. Kings were not seen as ordinary rulers. They were chosen by the gods, their authority flowing from the divine realm. This blending of divine myth with everyday life is what makes Mesopotamian religion so powerful. The myths were not simply stories told for entertainment. They were explanations, warnings, and promises that gave structure to a world that was often harsh and uncertain. And so the story continues from the creation of the universe, to the flood that nearly wiped out mankind, to the descent of Inanna into the underworld. Each tale adds another layer to the divine drama. Each myth weaves into the greater tapestry of Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths, where every god, every human, and every city plays its role in the eternal dance between chaos and order, life and death, despair and hope. Gilgamesh and the quest for immortality. From the myths of the gods and their cosmic struggles, the stories of Mesopotamia turn to heroes, figures who lived halfway between divine and human. Among them, none was more famous than Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. His story is one of the oldest epics ever written, carved into clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago. Gilgamesh was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He was a mighty warrior, a builder of great walls, and a ruler of immense strength. Yet his people often suffered under his harsh rule. He demanded too much from them, treating them less as subjects and more as tools for his ambition. The gods, seeing the cries of the people, decided to act. They created a wild man, Enkidu, to balance Gilgamesh's power. Enkidu lived among the animals, running free in the wilderness, his body covered in hair, his mind untouched by the ways of civilization. Hunters feared him, for he freed animals from their traps and lived as part of nature itself. To tame Enkidu, the people sent a temple woman named Shamhat. She brought him food, drink, and the ways of human love. Through her, Enkidu became part of the human world, no longer fully wild. When he came to Uruk, he challenged Gilgamesh, wrestling with him in the streets. Their struggle shook the city, but in the end, neither could defeat the other. Instead of enemies, they became brothers, bound by deep friendship. This bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is at the heart of the epic. Together, they sought adventures that would bring them fame and glory. Their greatest quest was the journey to defeat Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest. The cedar forest and Humbaba. The cedar forest was sacred, a place watched over by the sun god Shamash. But Gilgamesh, eager for glory, wanted to cut down the trees and kill the guardian who protected them. Enkidu, who once roamed the wild, warned him that this was dangerous. Yet Gilgamesh's determination won out, and with his friend beside him, he prepared for the battle. The journey to the forest was long, filled with dreams and omens. Each night, Gilgamesh had visions, and Enkidu interpreted them, encouraging his friend to see them as signs of victory. When they finally reached the cedar forest, they confronted Humbaba. Humbaba was described as a terrifying giant, his roar like a flood, his breath like fire. The two heroes struggled against him, but with the aid of Shamash, who sent great winds to bind Humbaba, they prevailed. Humbaba pleaded for his life, but Gilgamesh struck him down. Together, they cut down the sacred cedars and built a massive raft to carry the logs back to Uruk. Their victory brought fame, but it also brought consequences. By killing Humbaba, they had defied the gods and disrupted the balance of the world. The bull of heaven. The goddess Ishtar, known for her fierce passions, soon set her eyes on Gilgamesh. She offered him her love, promising him riches, power, and divine favor. But Gilgamesh mocked her, reminding her of the lovers she had betrayed and destroyed. Enraged, Ishtar went to her father Anu and demanded the bull of heaven, a monstrous creature that could bring famine and death. Anu agreed, and the bull descended upon Uruk, shaking the earth and slaying hundreds with each breath. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought it together. With great effort, they killed the bull, offering its heart to Shamash. Their triumph, however, only deepened the gods' anger. The Council of Gods decided that one of the two heroes must die as punishment for their defiance. Enkidu was chosen. The death of Enkidu. Enkidu fell ill, struck by a wasting disease sent by the gods. For 12 days, he lay in pain, cursing his fate, cursing the trapper who first saw him, cursing Shamhat, who had brought him into the world of humans. But eventually, he blessed her, recognizing that through her he had gained friendship and love. When Enkidu died, Gilgamesh was shattered. His grief was overwhelming. He mourned like a man possessed, refusing to bury his friend until the body decayed. The great king of Uruk, who once sought only glory, now faced the deepest truth. Death was stronger than even the mightiest of heroes. This moment marks a turning point in the epic. Gilgamesh, who once thought only of power and fame, became obsessed with the question of mortality. Could death be escaped? Could life be made eternal? His sorrow drove him into the wilderness, seeking answers. The search for immortality. Gilgamesh left Uruk behind and wandered far into the deserts and mountains. He sought the one man who had survived the great flood, the immortal Utnapishtim. If anyone could reveal the secret of eternal life, it was him. His journey took him to the ends of the earth, where he met strange beings and crossed dangerous paths. He traveled through the tunnel of the sun, a place of total darkness. He came to the Garden of Jewels, where trees bore gems instead of fruit. Finally, he reached the sea that surrounded the world, where he met the boatman Urshanabi. With his help, Gilgamesh crossed the waters of death and reached Utnapishtim. The wisdom of Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim told Gilgamesh the story of a flood, how the gods had once destroyed mankind but spared him because of Ea's warning. After surviving the flood, he and his wife were granted immortality as a unique gift. But Utnapishtim warned Gilgamesh that eternal life was not meant for humans. To test him, Utnapishtim challenged Gilgamesh to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. But as soon as he sat down, Gilgamesh fell asleep. When he woke, he realized his failure. Yet Utnapishtim's wife, moved by compassion, told her husband to offer Gilgamesh a hidden gift. She revealed a plant from the bottom of the sea, a plant that could restore youth. Gilgamesh, overjoyed, tied stones to his feet, dived into the waters, and retrieved the plant. He planned to bring it back to Uruk and share its gift with his people. But on the journey home, when he stopped to bathe, a serpent stole the plant, slithering away and shedding its skin as it gained renewed youth. Gilgamesh was left with nothing, except the wisdom he had gained from his journey. The return to Uruk. At last, Gilgamesh returned to Uruk. He looked at its great walls, the same walls he had once built with pride. Now he saw them differently, not just as monuments to his strength, but as symbols of human achievement. He realized that while he could not live forever, his works, his city, and his story would endure. Through loss and sorrow, Gilgamesh found a new kind of immortality, not in endless life, but in the memory left behind. The epic ends with him showing the strength of Uruk's walls, a lasting reminder of his reign. This tale, part of the wider web of Fall Asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths, connects the divine with the human, showing how even a mighty king must face death, and how wisdom comes not from victory, but from accepting the limits of life. Gods of death, war, and the underworld. After the epic of Gilgamesh revealed the limits of human life, the Mesopotamian myths turned often to the world beyond death. The underworld, ruled by shadow and silence, was not only home to the dead, but also the stage for powerful divine dramas. Here, gods of war, plague, and destruction walked alongside queens of the dead. Among these deities, one of the most fearsome was Nergal, the god of war, pestilence, and the scorching summer sun. His power was dreaded, for he could bring famine and disease as easily as he could bring strength and victory. Yet Nergal's story is not only one of terror, but also of passion and fate. Nergal and Ereshkigal. The tale begins when the gods of heaven held a great banquet. They sent an invitation to Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, but because she could not leave her realm, she sent her messenger to attend in her place. When the messenger delivered her words, Nergal mocked him and disrespected the queen of the dead. Outraged, Ereshkigal demanded that Nergal be sent down to her as punishment. The other gods tried to protect him, warning that no one returned from the underworld. But Nergal, armed with weapons and spells, descended anyway. At each of the 7 gates, just as Inanna once did, Nergal was forced to surrender a piece of his power. Yet unlike Inanna, Nergal fought his way through, striking down the guardians of the underworld until he stood before Ereshkigal herself. Ready to kill her, he was instead overcome by desire. The two became lovers, and Nergal stayed with her for 6 days. On the 7th, he slipped away and returned to heaven. But Ereshkigal would not be abandoned. She sent her messengers to the high gods, demanding his return. At last, Nergal descended again, not as a prisoner, but as her partner. He became king of the underworld beside her, ruling with both love and fear. This union of Nergal and Ereshkigal reflected the Mesopotamian view of life and death. The underworld was not separate from the world of the living. It was tied to it through passion, conflict, and balance. Just as the seasons changed and the rivers rose and fell, life and death were seen as forces bound together. The harsh realm of the dead, the Mesopotamian underworld itself, was always imagined as a bleak and joyless place. Souls entered through gates guarded by demons. Once inside, they lived in dust and darkness, feeding on scraps and shadows. Kings, warriors, and peasants alike shared the same fate. Offerings from the living were the only relief for these spirits. Food and drink left at graves, rituals performed by families. These allowed the dead to have some comfort. Without them, the spirits grew restless, wandering the earth to trouble the living. This fear of forgotten spirits was a constant part of Mesopotamian belief. To be remembered was to still receive offerings and prayers. To be forgotten was to truly vanish. In this way, the underworld myths taught people the importance of family, tradition, and memory. It is here again that we see how fall asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths carries not only tales of gods, but lessons about life itself. Honor the dead, maintain balance, and remember that death is a part of the eternal order. Ishtar and the powers of love and war. While Nergal and Ereshkigal ruled below, the goddess Ishtar, Inanna, continued to stir passion and turmoil above. Her power was not limited to love or fertility. She was also a goddess of war, leading armies into battle and inspiring kings to conquest. In one tale, Ishtar journeyed to the heavens to demand the bowl of heaven, as we saw in the story of Gilgamesh. In others, she sought to expand her dominion, even trying to conquer the underworld itself. Her dual nature, lover and destroyer, made her one of the most unpredictable deities. To love Ishtar was to risk ruin, but to anger her was far worse. She embodied the truth that desire and destruction are often intertwined. Crops grow because of love and fertility, but wars are also fought for passion and pride. Ishtar's worship in Mesopotamia was filled with music, dance, and offerings, but also with fear. She was the goddess who could lift a king to greatness or bring his empire crashing down. Shamash, the sun god of justice. Balancing the darker deities was Shamash, the sun god. Every day, he rode his chariot across the sky, bringing light to the earth. But Shamash was not only the bringer of light, he was also the god of justice. With his rays, he saw all things, exposing lies and guiding fairness. Kings often prayed to Shamash for wisdom in judgment. His role as judge of both gods and humans made him a central figure in maintaining order. In myths, he aided heroes like Gilgamesh, sending winds to bind Humbaba or granting omens that guided their paths. Shamash represented the hope that justice could triumph, even in a world filled with chaos. Where Nergal brought plague and Ishtar brought war, Shamash brought clarity and fairness, the weaving of fate. Above all these gods stood powers even greater, the concept of fate. The Mesopotamians believed that destiny was written and could not easily be changed. The gods themselves were bound to the tablets of destinies, powerful symbols that determined the order of the universe. In one myth, the storm god Ninurta battled the demon Anzu, who had stolen the tablets of destinies. With the tablets in Anzu's hands, the order of heaven and earth was thrown into chaos. Ninurta's victory restored balance, reminding both gods and men that fate was not to be stolen or defied. This belief in destiny shaped daily life. From the stars in the sky to the outcomes of wars, everything was thought to be part of a divine plan. Priests studied omens, inspected the livers of sacrificed animals, and read the movement of the heavens to glimpse this plan. For ordinary people, fate was unavoidable, but through ritual and devotion, they hoped to soften its edge. The fragile balance of the divine. The myths of Nergal, Ereshkigal, Ishtar, Shamash, and Ninurta reveal a universe always on the edge of disorder. Gods fought, loved, and betrayed one another just as humans did. The cosmos was fragile, maintained only through rituals, prayers, and respect for the divine. And in these stories, the people of Mesopotamia found reflections of their own lives. They knew the fear of plague, the devastation of war, the heat of the sun, and the certainty of death. To them, these were not random events. They were the work of the gods, whose stories explained the rhythms of the world. The myths connected everything: the rising of the sun, the changing of the seasons, the fate of kings, and the destiny of every soul. To tell these stories was to remember that life was part of a much greater pattern, one woven by divine hands long before humans were born. And so, the journey deepens, weaving together the tales of gods above and gods below, of justice and war, of death and renewal. Each thread adds to the tapestry of Fall Asleep, to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths, carrying us deeper into a world where every moment, every life, and every death was part of a sacred story. The Mesopotamian worldview, built on cycles of struggle, triumph, and renewal, shaped not only how they saw their gods, but also how they lived their daily lives. At the center of this divine drama was the relationship between humans and deities. Unlike later traditions, where gods might seem distant, the Mesopotamian gods were woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. Every harvest, every flood, every sickness, and every victory in war was seen as a reflection of divine will. Rituals were not optional. They were the very foundation of survival. If the gods were pleased, rivers would flow gently, crops would grow abundantly, and cities would flourish. If angered, storms, droughts, and invasions would follow. This constant balance between favor and wrath meant that priests, who could interpret the gods' desires, were some of the most powerful figures in society. One of the most fascinating aspects of Mesopotamian belief was how their myths explained not only the cosmos, but also human purpose. For instance, the myth of Atrahasis, a story that predates and parallels the later tale of Noah's flood, tells us how humanity came to exist and why suffering became part of life. The gods, according to this tale, once labored to maintain creation. They dug canals, raised the fields, and bore the burdens of the world. But after endless toil, they grew weary and rebelled against their higher gods. To solve this crisis, the great god Enki suggested the creation of humankind. Humans would serve as workers, relieving the gods of their endless burdens. From clay, mingled with the blood of a slain god, humanity was formed. This moment was seen not as a gift, but as a necessity. Humans existed to serve. Ritual sacrifices, offerings of food and drink, and the construction of temples were ways of feeding and sustaining the gods. But this arrangement came with challenges. As humans multiplied, their noise disturbed the gods, leading them to unleash plagues, droughts, and finally the Great Flood. In Atrahasis, Enki warned one man, Atrahasis himself, to build a boat and preserve life. He gathered his family, animals, and provisions, and when the waters came, they overwhelmed the land. After the flood subsided, Atrahasis offered sacrifices, and the gods, starving from lack of offerings, gathered like flies around the smoke. Enlil, who had ordered the destruction, was furious, but Enki argued for mercy. From this compromise, humanity's fate was sealed. Shorter lifespans, mortality, and suffering would be their lot. This story reveals so much about Mesopotamian thought. Unlike later traditions that see the flood as a punishment for moral corruption, here it was simply about balance, noise, and divine frustration. It paints the gods as deeply human in their emotions, angry, hungry, irritable, but also capable of compassion. Moving forward, another powerful narrative emerges in the myths surrounding Inanna, the goddess of love, beauty, and war. She was one of the most complex and fascinating figures in the pantheon. Unlike the male gods who often represented singular forces, Inanna embodied contradictions. She was the bringer of fertility, passion, and abundance, yet also a fierce warrior who delighted in chaos and destruction. Her most famous myth is the descent into the underworld. In this story, Inanna chooses to descend into the realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. Some say she did it out of ambition, desiring to extend her dominion into the land of the dead. Others suggest it was out of sympathy, as her sister grieved the loss of her husband. Whatever her reason, the tale takes on a haunting, dreamlike quality. Inanna prepared herself with symbols of power, a crown, beads, a breastplate, and robes of authority. She approached the gates of the underworld, demanding entry. But Ereshkigal, enraged at her intrusion, forced her to pass through 7 gates. At each gate, one item of power was stripped away, her crown, her jewels, her garments, until she stood naked and powerless before the queen of the dead. Inanna was judged, struck down, and hung on a hook like rotting meat. The world above withered in her absence. Fertility ceased, love vanished, and war ground to a halt. The balance of life itself began to collapse. It was only through the intervention of Enki, who sent servants to trick Ereshkigal, that Inanna was released. Yet her escape came at a cost. Someone had to take her place in the underworld. When she returned to the living, she found her husband Dumuzi sitting proudly on his throne, indifferent to her suffering. In fury, she condemned him to be carried off as her replacement. Yet later, through compromise, it was agreed that Dumuzi would spend part of the year in the underworld, while his sister took his place for the remainder. This myth not only explained the cycles of fertility and seasons, spring and summer representing Dumuzi's return, autumn and winter his descent, but also revealed the raw, emotional intensity of the Mesopotamian gods. They were not distant abstractions, but beings who loved, hated, grieved, and punished with terrifying force. As you listen to these tales, you can feel how the people of Mesopotamia sought to understand the fragility of life around them. Floods, droughts, death, and renewal were not random. They were woven into the stories of their deities. To fall asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths is to drift into a world where every natural cycle is alive with divine emotion, where love and loss are written into the soil itself. Yet Inanna's story also gave strength, particularly to women. She embodied power and independence in a world that often placed women in restricted roles. She was bold, ambitious, and unafraid to challenge even death itself. Through her, people could see that even suffering carried the seeds of renewal. At this point, the Mesopotamian pantheon had revealed itself as a tapestry of complexity. From the distant Anu to the stormbringer Enlil, the cunning Enki, the mighty Marduk, and the fierce Inanna, each god reflected both the chaos and the beauty of the world. Their myths did more than entertain. They explained why humans existed, why suffering was unavoidable, and why renewal was always just beyond despair. But the story does not end here. Beyond these well-known myths lie darker, stranger, and more mysterious tales. Stories of demons, monsters, and forgotten gods who lurked in the shadows of the Mesopotamian imagination. To continue, we must step deeper into the twilight realms of myth, where human fears of death, illness, and the unknown gave rise to beings far more terrifying than the great gods themselves. As Mesopotamian myths grew and spread, they began to form not just stories about the gods, but frameworks for human behavior, law, and kingship. The gods were not distant deities watching silently. They were active forces guiding, punishing, rewarding, and shaping the destinies of men and women. To fall asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths is to drift through this world where divine will and human ambition constantly collided. One of the most fascinating aspects of Mesopotamian mythology is the way it tied religion directly to kingship. Kings were often seen as chosen by the gods, guardians of divine order, and keepers of justice on earth. Hammurabi, the famous Babylonian king, is a prime example. His legal code, one of the earliest in history, was framed not merely as his personal wisdom, but as divine instruction delivered by Shamash, the sun god of justice. When a Mesopotamian king declared laws or built temples, he was acting as the earthly representative of the god's order. The myths ensured that the authority of rulers was never just political, it was sacred. But this divine favor was never unconditional. If kings failed in their duties or neglected the gods, myths taught that disaster would follow. Floods, famine, invasions. These were interpreted as punishments from deities who demanded respect and offerings. The myth of the Great Flood, often compared with the biblical story of Noah, is one of the clearest examples. In the Mesopotamian version, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a deluge because of their noise and disobedience. Yet one man, Atrahasis, or in other versions Utnapishtim, was warned and survived by building a great boat. This theme of divine punishment balanced with mercy highlights how the Mesopotamians viewed their place in the cosmos, fragile, but still under the watchful gaze of the gods. Another crucial aspect of Mesopotamian belief was the underworld. While many cultures imagined afterlife as a paradise or a place of judgment, Mesopotamian myths describe the land of the dead as a shadowy, dreary place where all souls, good or bad, wandered. This underworld, ruled by Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead, was unavoidable. Even great heroes and kings could not escape it. The descent of Inanna into the underworld is one of the most haunting stories, showing how even the mightiest goddess was not above the laws of death. The myth reminds listeners of the inescapable balance of life. The gods could grant power and glory, but death was universal. This worldview shaped how Mesopotamians lived. Religion was less about securing eternal bliss and more about maintaining harmony with the divine in this life. Sacrifices, prayers, and rituals were not meant to guarantee heaven, but to prevent chaos, disaster, or divine wrath. Each festival, each temple, and each sacred rite was a way of reaffirming the bond between humans and their gods. Among the most extraordinary myths is the cycle surrounding Ishtar and Tammuz. Tammuz, the shepherd god associated with fertility and rebirth, was deeply loved by Ishtar. When he died and descended into the underworld, the earth became barren. Ishtar's mourning and her attempts to bring him back symbolized the seasonal cycles of death and renewal. Every year, rituals echoed this myth, reminding people of the god's influence on agriculture and survival. The story made it clear, the rhythm of the fields, the growing of crops, and the turning of seasons were inseparable from divine drama. The cosmic order also revolved around the tablets of destiny, a powerful mythological object believed to contain the fate of gods and humans alike. Whoever possessed the tablets wielded immense power. In different myths, control of these tablets shifts between gods, showing the fragile and often chaotic nature of divine authority. Even the gods were not immune to challenges and struggles. They too had rivalries, victories, and defeats. This dynamic, unpredictable world of myths shows that the Mesopotamians never saw their gods as infallible. Instead, their deities reflected human qualities: jealousy, ambition, love, fear, and even cruelty. In this way, the myths were not only religious explanations, but also mirrors of human society. The gods fought as kings fought, they loved as people loved, and they mourned as humans mourned. To listen to these stories, to drift into sleep while exploring them, is to step into a place where the divine and human are forever entangled. These myths continue to echo across history, influencing later traditions, from the Hebrew Bible to Greek myths, and shaping how humans understand the relationship between gods and people. The final chapter. As Mesopotamian myths reach their twilight, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of history and legend. The gods who shaped the rivers, the skies, and the earth were not just distant figures. They were woven into every breath, every harvest, and every prayer of the people. From the powerful Stormbringer Enlil to the wise Ea, from the radiant Inanna to the relentless Nergal, the pantheon represented the cosmic balance that Mesopotamians both feared and cherished. But what happened when those ancient civilizations faded? When empires like Babylon and Assyria crumbled into the dust? The stories did not vanish. They transformed, carried forward into new religions, reshaped into myths that reached far beyond the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. The influence of these tales echoes in the myths of Greece, the traditions of the Hebrews, and even in modern storytelling. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we touched upon earlier, was preserved on clay tablets, waiting thousands of years to be uncovered by archaeologists. Its lessons about friendship, mortality, and the human yearning for meaning are timeless. It shows how even in the shadow of death, the pursuit of legacy and wisdom endures. This epic reminds us that the Mesopotamian people were deeply aware of life's fragility, yet they never ceased to dream of immortality. The myths of Inanna's descent into the underworld, of Tiamat's defeat by Marduk, of the creation of humanity from clay mixed with divine essence. All of these were attempts to answer eternal questions. Why are we here? What forces govern our world? What lies beyond death? The Mesopotamians did not shy away from these mysteries. Instead, they told stories that gave them shape and meaning. When we speak of divine kingship, it's impossible not to notice how it shaped political structures across history. Mesopotamian rulers claimed the favor of the gods to justify their power, much like later kings across the world did. The ziggurats, rising high into the sky, were not just temples. They were stairways connecting heaven and earth. They were tangible reminders of the sacred order. And so, when we reflect on these myths, we also reflect on ourselves. The fears of floods, the dreams of prosperity, the longing for protection. They are the same emotions we carry today, though expressed differently. In many ways, these stories are not just about gods and myths. They are about us, about the eternal human need to explain and to belong. It is here that the fall asleep to the entire story of Mesopotamian gods and myths comes to a close. We have journeyed through the origins of the world, the rise of gods and empires, the cycles of life and death, and the legacy that carried forward into the ages. And though the temples may have crumbled and the rivers changed course, the stories remain. These myths are like whispers carried by the desert wind, reminding us that every civilization leaves behind echoes of its soul. The Mesopotamians dreamed of gods, of heroes, of worlds beyond our own. And in doing so, they gave us the foundation of myth itself. So as you drift into sleep, imagine the glow of oil lamps flickering on clay tablets, the sound of ancient chants beneath the stars, and the steady flow of the rivers where it all began. Let the voices of the past guide you into rest, where gods and myths linger in timeless memory. Thank you for listening, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders of Mesopotamia.